All right, welcome back. I hope you're having an awesome time so far. Our next speaker is Jessica Sachs. She's the Vice President of Training at Morgan Properties. Please join me in welcoming Jessica to our virtual stage.
Thank you so much for having me. Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Sachs, and I have the pleasure of leading the training team for Morgan Properties. So a little bit about my company. It was founded by Mitch Morgan in 1985, and we've been in operation for 35 years. And we are a leading apartment management and investment firm based out of King of Prussia, Pennsylvania. As an owner and operator with over $8 billion in investment, more than 348 multifamily apartment communities, and with over 93,000 units across the Mid-Atlantic, Texas, Michigan, Nashville, and the Northeast, Morgan Properties currently spans across 20 different states. Since 2013 alone, we've acquired over $5 billion in total acquisition volume. More specifically, since 2019, Morgan has grown from the 19th to the second largest apartment owner in the country, as ranked by the National Multifamily Housing Council. With our three most recent acquisitions closing between November of 2020 and February of this year, let me put that in terms of team members. We've just about doubled the total number of employees in less than 2 years, which, as you can imagine, has significantly impacted our support strategies. Now, combine that growth with an unprecedented global pandemic, and you have a recipe for chaos. Existing team member support was weakened, with less than half of our current employees having operated with our current policies and procedures for more than 2 years, and their travel availability was also severely reduced. Additionally, with the expanded geographic footprint, the logistics of coordinating either formal or informal support became even more cumbersome and expensive. So I know I'm here today to talk to you about virtual training and the future of virtual training. What we've found over the last year and a half in moving from 100% in-person training module to 100% virtual training module is that there are both pros and cons to moving to that virtual training space. From the pro side, we found that it's cheaper, it's easier, and it's more flexible than that traditional in-person learning. However, we also found that virtual only created higher disengagement, less connections, and an altered expectation on importance of that training. So now I'm going to tell you my story of the last year and a half and moving from that 100% in-person to 100% virtual into 3 separate parts. First is the lead up, or the pre-pandemic. The second part will be the main event, or the active pandemic. And the third part will be the future and what we expect to have happen over the next year to 5. So I'm going to start with the lead up. Sometime in Q2 of 2019, as a part of a budgeting process exercise, I completed an analysis to get an average onboarding training cost per team member. I aggregated travel, lodging, food, etc., and provided a cost per day of training. For the sake of easy math today, let's say it was around $100 a day. Now, keep in mind, this number does not include the payroll costs. It is purely an added expense or an expenditure related to that onboarding training. For our office team members, they were onboarded with 5 days of training. Service managers had 3, and technicians had 1. Now, assuming we had a straight industry standard turnover of 26% for each position, those costs per day increased to around $135 a day when adjusted for the turnover. Combine this with our rapidly expanding geography, and our cost per day was only going to be driven up further. At the time, this one line item was encroaching on over 22% of my department's budget, with projected annual increases in excess of 24%. However, this particular training was only representative of less than 15% of our overall departmental function. So obviously, the fiscally responsible decision is to reduce that in-person training and start moving towards utilizing our virtual presentation skills. Now, I know I'm not the only one who initially had some reservations. We've all seen poorly produced or facilitated webinars, and if not done well, it can actually alienate your audience, or quite simply become background noise as they take a nap or multitask. So I started doing some research on how to make sure that we did it better. And after a lot of thought and discussions and planning, my entire team was enrolled in a 6-week intensive virtual training boot camp hosted by a consultant we hired specifically to work with us on our online and virtual facilitation skills. And I cannot stress this enough. We didn't know how much we didn't know about engaging online facilitation, and the results were profound. Almost immediately, it altered our long-term plan. Instead of moving maybe 1 or 2 classes virtually, we were now going to start moving entire training tracks. Now, in retrospect, this was the moment. Getting our trainers this development was absolutely pivotal in our team's ability to continue supporting our operational teams in the year to come. And as a side note, I know I will never ever have better timing again in my life. So now the hard work really started. First, we had to take our day-long classes and begin breaking them up into separate modules. Then we had to completely rewrite the materials and deliverables and facilitation guides for targeted virtual delivery. And third, we had to plan out the transition, since this would be a significant cultural shift from our current onboarding practices. So initially, here's our timeline. Q1 of 2020 was supposed to identify and separate out the individual modules. Q2 for rewrites, Q3 for testing and beginning to execute the communications plan. Q4 to phase in the revised training tracks, and with the end goal of having our virtual training in full operation by the end of the year. So spoiler alert, that plan blew up, was thrown in a dumpster, and then lit on fire. Which brings us to the main event. Shutdown 2020. Our team was facilitating in-person training actually that week in 3 separate locations. And on Wednesday, March 11th, it was decided that we would begin closing corporate offices that following Friday, the 13th. So travel was rearranged for all trainees and trainers to return home, and classes were canceled. That was actually the last time we facilitated in-person new hire classes. Immediately, our team of 14 began focusing on 3 specific projects in front of us. The first was converting over 96 hours of our onboarding training into separate virtual modules. While also furiously working through the training development, we had to flip an entire system rollout plan that was impacting over 1/3 of the company to a virtual presentation and a virtual rollout, as well as a company-wide fair housing refresher. So we had 3 large projects in less than 3 weeks. So it was daunting to say the least. How did we start? We put together small teams to work on each of the 3 separate initiatives based on internal strengths and agreed upon a format and requirements for the facilitator and producer guides. We also scheduled train the trainers so that every single member of the team would be able to facilitate every single module. For additional support, we had 1 subject matter expert signed up to attend each class's delivery to be able to handle additional questions, as the facilitator would have had minimal time to prepare, and this also alleviated the need to become an expert on the system or material. They could instead focus on keeping the teams engaged and implementing their newly honed virtual facilitation skills. In the background, all available hands were assigned to the various new hire onboarding modules, which was going to be the heaviest lift. With so many different people involved in the training material development, I had a major concern that from a learner perspective, it would quickly become disjointed and not feel cohesive. So to counteract, I assigned 2 people specifically to review all of the prepared training for consistency and continuity in language direction and overall presentation. I won't sugarcoat this. There were a lot of late nights. It was a massive undertaking with completely unrealistic deadlines, insane external stressors, because just like the rest of the world, as all of this was going on, all of our team members were also balancing work with childcare and family care and illnesses and just general stress in getting through the day. So we implemented Zoom. We scheduled all the classes, registered everyone, and tracked attendance all manually. And we successfully delivered engaging and interactive virtual training in those first 3 weeks. So within 1 week, we were able to present a 90-minute fair housing refresher, and we did so more than 28 times. Within 2 weeks, the system rollout training began for over 100 locations, encompassing over 67 hours of initial and follow-up support training. And finally, by the 3rd week, we were able to offer the full onboarding training for all of our new hires across the country. So in April, that curricula was delivered to over 75 people alone. This was absolutely impossible. And in retrospect, I'm still not quite sure how we got it all done. Outside of bubblegum and Scotch tape and a whole lot of positive thinking, we did actually learn a few strategies that have continued to define how we work as a team. The first is trust and vulnerability. With the intense environment, there was quite literally no time or energy to second guess yourself or to take feedback personally. Tension, competition, or minor rifts among team members all but evaporated. And I attribute this in large part to that shared trauma they experienced. Meetings are frequently interrupted by kids or roommates or needy pets, prompting personal, not just professional bonds and empathy, even if we were physically separated. Flexible hours became the norm, and for the first time, everyone on the team was on an even playing field, instead of the remote team members feeling out of loop. They started trusting each other and me, and the team began to function at a higher level. Stepping back as a leader and focusing my energy on defining objectives, delegating tasks, and clearing roadblocks, it actually allowed my team members the freedom to just get it done without feeling the pressure for it to be perfect. And I never realized that I had created that pressure until it wasn't there. They now had permission to get it done now and fix it later, and we will keep fixing it until it's up to our standards. This task was absolutely impossible, so any process or any progress was considered success and celebrated as such. As for lasting impacts, I've witnessed team members more willing to take risks and test out new tools or games or activities, knowing that their teammates have their back if things don't work out. Ultimately, we did get it done and we did get it delivered. It certainly wasn't pretty that first month, but it was functional. And I've noticed that these interactions and collaborative strategies have remained in place today. So the following 3 months were spent fine-tuning and adjusting the training, weekly reviews of all module content, identifying areas teams might be disengaging, adding in or changing activities to drive interactivity, changing slides, changing text, collecting experience surveys, and analyzing every single area that could be improved. Since every team member played a role in the development of the class, there were no egos regarding updates or changes because everyone had ownership. Finally, these classes were up to our standards, including fully developed producer and facilitator guides, follow-up steps, and report cards for every single class. Just in time, as it turns out, because although we didn't know it yet, our acquisition department had been hard at work securing another 2 portfolios that we would end up closing on before the end of the year. These 2 acquisitions are notable not because they were the largest acquisitions, they weren't, or because they pulled us into new markets, most of our acquisitions do that, but because this would be the very first time we went through the whole acquisition process without guaranteed on-site support for all properties. These acquisitions now pose the question, how do you take around 200 new employees, flip all of their systems and processes overnight and get them up and operating without missing a beat, all without somebody physically there who knows what they're doing? Well, we structured support in 3 separate ways. We arranged for regional level team members to be physically available during that first week to assist with processing and setup. Virtual Teams channels were created for each new acquisition site and manned by existing high-performing team members with the single objective of acting as a mini help desk and motivational coach for these team members, essentially a one point of contact. No matter what the issue or the problem was, they reached out to this Teams channel, and that team then went and hunted down the answer. Finally, based on staffing levels and or performance concerns, properties were ranked on a scale of red, orange, yellow, or green, monitoring progress until they were all operating independently at an acceptable or a green level. Red and orange sites had physical support deployed, and yellow sites were closely monitored for intervention needs. All on-site support was coordinated and communicated with and feedback collected by one singular team member charged with operating the support for that acquisition. This streamlined communication among all support teams to make it much more effective, but it also allowed for adjustments to be made faster and ultimately the leadership of those sites to be better supported. The third acquisition recently closed at the end of February of this year and was actually one of our largest, with 47 new assets and 300 new team members across 11 states to onboard. Based on what we learned from the prior 2, the support structure remained the same with one change. Separate onboarding schedules were created and staggered to ensure operational coverage. Additionally, we learned that some systems are more complicated to learn virtually without physical reinforcement, or having someone who knows what they're doing working alongside a new team member. So these individual classes were offered multiple times to increase competency and confidence, with all recordings of the classes provided to the team members for them to access on demand. However, even with these improvements, we still learned a few things that we will be implementing on the next portfolio. So you'll have to catch up with me later to hear what worked and what still may need to be tweaked. Now that we've been able to kind of catch our breath, and we began to evaluate some of the benefits from this experience of being forced to go from 100% in person to 100% virtual for rollouts, initiatives, onboarding, acquisition, all of our support. As I initially stated, we found that it was cheaper, it was easier, and it was much more flexible. But we actually found a little bit more to it than that. Cost is pretty straightforward. We went from $135 a day to $0 a day in additional outlay and cost. But when we talk about it being easier, let's look at that in two pieces. Number one is capacity. We went from a fixed capacity to unlimited. By using additional producers and breakout rooms, we're able to host classes of any size without adding any additional rooms or chairs or locations, which brings us to logistics. Went from being complex to now simple. No more shipping laptops all over, arranging training schedules and travel schedules. We're now able to reach anyone, anywhere, just as easily as our neighbors down the street. We used to have to identify geographic hubs to host training, and now we're no longer limited by these restrictions. Taking this a step further, so far we've only talked about the benefit for the company, but we did find some significant benefits for the learner. The flexibility based on learner preferences, that they can type or talk for questions and or engagement, which allows for other types of learners to participate outside of the traditional raise your hand in class method. But also timing. Learners are now able to access classes earlier and on their schedules as opposed to ours. They're also able to stagger the classes to allow for better absorption, while also allowing the participants to continue operating on their site. And delivery. Classes actually ended up being shorter in length while also being able to provide the learner with an immediate recording of that class, which they can then replay or rewatch on demand as needed, allowing for multiple reviews of the material or as many times as needed to gain mastery. So far in our analysis, it appears that it was an absolute genius move to implement this 100% virtual training model and to revolutionize how new team members are brought on board and trained. But it's not all roses and sunshine. As stated in the beginning, there is some resistance to adoption and some baseline limitations we've discovered. Having refined our strategy over the last year, it came down to three things: higher disengagement, lower connections, and altered expectations. So let's examine those a little bit closer. Higher disengagement. There are more distractions, especially when you hear a virtual class, your instant inclination is that it's going to be boring. So getting that protected training time was and is a challenge. Participants cannot stop in the middle of a class to take a quick tour or answer a quick call and expect to not miss anything or to be able to pick right back up where they left off. Since our classes are designed to be highly interactive, the facilitators were quickly becoming aware when these situations were happening. Thinking about this comparatively, we rarely, if ever, had issues with people walking in and out of an in-person training, but that's essentially how some virtual classes were being attended. And while a portion of this lies with setting expectations with leadership, upon further inspection, there appears to be an inherent lack of accountability in a virtual class versus in person. If you're in a physical class, everyone can see if you're texting or if you've checked out. In a virtual one, it's a lot easier to hide. So consequently, participants would attempt to listen to the class as they responded to an email or were completing processing tasks on site. As per multiple studies and articles, including one in Psychology Today, as well as the Harvard Business Review, science has proven that we do not actually multitask well at all. And if nothing else, we have found that virtual modules have to be targeted with shorter, cleaner presentations and provide more breaks that are clearly identified at the beginning of the class and more conversational to maintain that engagement. While you may get away with asking a question to the class every 10 to 15 minutes on a live training, you must call in specific team members or utilize specific instructions much more frequently to fight the urge of your participants to disengage and begin multitasking. Essentially, where you may have been able to rely on your natural ability as a facilitator to read the room, insert energy where needed, and use your physical presence to ensure everyone is tuned into and understanding the content, virtual classes have to be much more structured and require a significant amount of pre-planning to get a similar result. Connections. Because training is now modular, there is more involvement in the learner to manage their own learning path. Again, that simple show up somewhere to training is not the plan. The learner has to become much more involved. There are written documents to be printed, material to be read, attendance schedules to manage, and a reasonable level of tech savviness to access the classes. And while we try to make it as simple to access as possible, if a team member struggles to make a FaceTime call, they may also struggle to maintain their calendar and attend classes on time. These components present obstacles for the learner to feel connected to their instructor and to the material. As we know, with adult learners, we must protect the ego. If the learner is put in a position where they feel unsure, unsupported, or unsuccessful in a virtual class, it's much easier to simply write it off as an ineffective class. And to their credit, and from their perspective, it is in fact ineffective if we fail to build that connection. Sometimes too, there are certain complex processes that specific learners aren't able to grasp as quickly or as well when not in person, with direct guidance to again protect that sense of self and build confidence in the process itself. And finally, no connections between new hires are built since there's no casual conversation over lunch or during breaks. So it's a struggle to connect these new team members to the bigger picture, to the company, or to teams outside of their immediate location. And third, altered expectations. Field team members had varying mindsets regarding virtual training, and we had a lot of work to do in adjusting their expectations on how the onboarding track would work so that they could continue to support their new team members. It wasn't to send them away and they'll come back trained type of move anymore. The manager had to get involved. The formal training was now happening more slowly, over 2 to 3 weeks, and they were required to schedule that protected time be set aside so that their new team member could attend training. Since classes are online and not in your face, there was a feeling that they were optional and not a big deal to miss or multitask during one, since they could simply request a recording to watch or not watch later. And ultimately, this came down to resetting the expectations with leadership to drive the behavior at the site level. If we were going to do this all over, this crucial step should be tracked as part of that initial communication. It took a lot longer to identify this as the root cause and to begin remedial actions than what it could have been if it was corrected from the beginning, if I had implemented a stronger communication strategy from the get-go. A year later, and some of our most committed teams are now able to authorize office closures when there's training to ensure attendance if there is not proper coverage. Which brings us to the future. So what does this all boil down to? What is the ultimate solution for training and onboarding support? Simple, I don't know. What I do know is that the cost and benefit of moving onboarding to 100% virtual has made it all but impossible to return to the old way, particularly in the volatile job market pushing that turnover rate higher. I also know that we're missing a big opportunity, specifically regarding the connection of new team members together with something bigger than their individual properties. What we are going to be testing as we move towards the summer and fall is a hybrid approach with flexible and adaptive formatting. Onboarding classes are moving to consecutive delivery with a block schedule on a 6-week rotation. What this means is no matter when a new team member starts, they'll have the options and availability to take all of their classes in a few days or a few weeks, and in a flexible order based on the property needs. We will begin capitalizing on the benefits of being able to offer a virtual onboarding experience. But the second component in Q3, we're targeting to add in-person refreshers delivered regionally to support both new and existing hires, thus combining that virtual delivery and in-person facilitation to increase retention and the effectiveness of the learning process. Topics will include some regular offerings of some more complex systems, with space for flexibility based on individual market or operational challenges. While facilitating at a regional level, the costs will be controlled and participant travel will be marginalized. This too will begin to build bridges and connections outside of those individual communities. Third, we plan to offer pre-recorded modules for the learner who prefers to learn asynchronously, which is a fancy way of saying learners who prefer a more self-guided approach or who have schedules that prevent them from attending a live class. The added benefit of this is that it may actually reduce class sizes and allowing for potentially more effective use of that class time with those smaller classes, because those team members who prefer the asynchronous learning will be able to stay on track with their synchronous counterparts. Ultimately, our goal is to continue adjusting and adapting to the needs of the field so that we continue to provide a training schedule and delivery method that appeals to each learner. To be effective, we must accomplish this while providing enough flexibility for minimal operational impact with maximum learning effect to maintain that leadership buy-in. Because it doesn't matter how they learn, it matters what they learn. Our job should continue to focus on finding creative ways to present the how so that they can focus on the what. I fully expect to continue evaluating our team's performance against these objectives, and we'll keep adjusting our offering and presentation styles as the results dictate. This includes pushing for continual and consistent professional development for the team members who are tasked with facilitating, producing, or creating these training modules for both virtual and in-person delivery. Perhaps this isn't the end of in-person classes, but rather the beginning of a more learner-centric programming style. I'd like to end this chat with a quote that's kept me motivated over the last year and a half. Don't waste a crisis, and I don't believe we have. Onward and upward. Till next time. Thank you so much for your time.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing this with us. If you can stop sharing your screen, I know the audience is going to give you a huge virtual round of applause. That was awesome, and we really appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us today. For the audience, it's time for you to make your way to your next session. Along the way, make sure you accept your connection request and take some time to check out our amazing exhibits. Thanks so much, and we'll see you around.